It's wonderful. This is such a great library, and this exhibit is the best.
My heart is still pounding. I am a Sherlock Holmes lunatic, and so seeing this celebration of that literature and that character is also thrilling.
Thrilling. It's really wonderful to see the stuff out, to see the stuff that the Lilly has, to see the building itself. It's great to see all that we've gathered here, and I can't tell you.
This is fun.
This is amazing.
This is incredible. There are absolute treasures here you can't find anywhere else.
Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the West Express, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at westexpress.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 180, live from the Lilly Library.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Walder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Walder.
And we are fresh back from Bloomington, Indiana. Do you have a fresh bloom on you now, Burt?
I do. My nose is red, but my heart is warm. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm out of colors now.
Well, we are going
and
to...
temperature.
We have a wonderful show queued up for you here. We're going to recap some of the things that happened and the people we interacted with, actual sound clips of those people for you here on this show from the BSI Lilly Library Conference. You may recall about 5 episodes or so ago, we talked to you about the Building and Archive Conference that was going to be happening at the Lilly Library as the BSI relocated its trust, its archival material, to the Rare Book Depository at the University of Indiana. After, of course, we give you this housekeeping, which is that if you'd like to comment on this show, we would welcome your comments. You can find the show notes on the app that you're using. Just swipe up, scroll up, swipe over. I don't know exactly how your app works. You probably do. Or you can simply go to ihose.co/ihose180, all lowercase, and you can find the show notes there. You can leave a comment for us there. You can also send us an email by simply sending an email to comment@ihearofsherlock.com. You can find us on all of the social networks where we are I Hear of Sherlock on each one of those, and you can dial us up at 774-221-7323. That's 774-221-READ. Well, speaking of reading, Burt, you do a pretty good job of reading the room, and as you went from person to person, there were a lot of different reactions and stories to tell, and I'd like you to take us through this journey, which we're going to pepper with all kinds of sounds and give people an understanding of what it was like to be at this conference in Indiana.
I'm happy to. It was enormous fun, really. We had a terrific turnout. And as we'll tell you in a moment, Mike Whelan kicked off Saturday afternoon by remarking about how gratifying that turnout was. I think we had 100. The number I kept hearing was 100 attendees. I don't know if that's accurate. But we will tell you in later on in this show some of the very interesting and very peculiar things that happened around the conference with its start and so on, but we're not going to do that right now. We want to begin with the exhibition at the Lilly, which took place on Saturday morning in an exhibition titled The BSI in 221 Objects, and it was an absolutely fabulous display, and we took the opportunity to talk to various people about what they thought of the conference, and some of the voices you've already heard: Marsha Pollak, Glen Miranker, Steve Rothman, Peter Blau, Chris Zordan, Ray Betzner. And in talking to Ray, one of the things we pointed out that it was very rare and unprecedented, in fact, to see the books from the trilogy dinner all in one place in such a pristine presentation. And for those of our listeners who, might not know about that particular milestone in Sherlockian history, we asked Ray, tell us why are the books from the trilogy dinner, and why was the trilogy dinner so important?
This is incredible. There are absolute treasures here you can't find anywhere else. For example, all 3 books from the trilogy dinner are here in one place. You can go to bookshops or maybe dealers' rooms and see 1 or 2 books, or maybe you'll see them individually. But the invitation to the dinner, all 3 books from the dinner, autographs from the dinner, letters about the dinner, they're all here. It tells the whole story in one place. It was the greatest flowering of the golden age of Sherlockian commentary, especially dealing with the Baker Street Irregulars. These 3 books have wonderful essays in them. They really deserve to be reread today and enjoyed all over again. So I think that's the reason why it's important.
Now, for listeners who may not understand what the trilogy dinner refers to, this was a special co-ed dinner that the BSI put on in 1944, March 31st, 1944. It was a little off-cycle. The BSI had already had its January annual meeting, which of course was STAG in those days. And in this case, this dinner was to celebrate the launch, the almost simultaneous launch of 3 separate books by members of the Baker Street Irregulars. And of course, those books included Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, a textbook of friendship by Christopher Morley. They included Profile by Gaslight, edited by Edgar W. Smith, and of course, 221B by Vincent Sterrett. I think I'm getting those right. I'm doing that all from memory and not looking over at my bookshelf. And the remarkable thing, as we saw about the invitation that was in the case with these 3 books, was that these books were all by different publishers. And to think that publishers would come together at a single event to support the book launches of their competitors was really something remarkable.
It was, and it's another example of how Sherlock Holmes brings people together, how the common enjoyment of Sherlock Holmes is a great source for unity. But in Ray's remarks, too, you heard some of the enthusiasm that infected really everybody who was there at the exhibition. Now, for those of you who haven't visited the Lilly is a massive, wonderful structure, and past the entranceway, as you first come into the Lilly Library, there's this huge room. This was completely filled with this exhibition. There were, I can't count the number, 6 or 9 huge glass-covered tables, each displaying the artifacts associated with these 221 objects in some form. There were cases on the walls in which, among other things, we had copies of the publications through the years of the BSI Press. And then there are 2 rooms nearby in which particularly rare objects were on display. And we'll be talking a little bit about some of those. But in one of those rooms, there was one particular object that Stephen Rothman very kindly commented on and put this in some perspective in terms of his own enthusiasm.
So to see the only letter written by Sherlock Holmes and hold it in my hands, woof!
And this, of course, is the letter that Holmes wrote to Watson in The Final Problem, in a handwriting that looked suspiciously like that of Arthur Conan Doyle. And so we had many spirited discussions about the provenance of this, but this is one of the rarest among the Sherlockian items in the Lilly Library. And in the same room, we also were able to see the manuscript of the Red Circle, an original Beaton's Christmas Annual, and many other artifacts of Sherlockian interest. And it was a great opportunity to stop and talk to Mike Whelan just for a few seconds, because it's the placement of the BSI Archive at the Lilly Library has been a major initiative, a major focus of Mike's work, and he put that in some perspective for us.
It feels great because for many years, either Marianne or I were the chairman of the Lilly Friends, and so we've got this affinity and closeness, and we know all the staff here, and it's been fun. And the Lilly is a wonderful home for the BSI Archive.
It really is a wonderful home because, as you've heard, if you've listened to our previous shows that took place at the Lilly or referred to the archive, the Lilly is particularly welcoming for researchers of all kinds. And it's a wonderful environment in which to explore some of this material and some of the other material they have on display. And one of the nice things about the conference was that we had the opportunity to see many old friends who came to Bloomington from many different parts of the world. And one of them was our friend from Canada, Hartley Nathan.
Came to the Lilly Library and was dazzled to see a first edition of Shakespeare and Chaucer and Alice in Wonderland amongst the three favorite authors beyond Arthur Conan Doyle. It's just a great place and great people to be with. I've seen photographs of people whose names I'd just heard of, and here they are almost in real life. And it's a great display of stuff. You know, you can't help it. If you're not a Sherlockian, it still is of interest to people. Just the history of it, the White House writing letters, and very exciting. The only problem is I don't see anything from Pierre Trudeau or his son Justin. You know, and as a Canadian, I'm looking for stuff Canadian. Maybe Sherlock Holmes will come back and write something about Canada, other than the fact that Myers Toronto and the Hound of the Baskervilles. I love it.
Oh, our poor Canadian friends. Always so good-natured and so good-humored, and yet so overlooked.
But certainly not in our hearts. But it was great to see Hartley. And right after we talked to Hartley, we also had a chance to talk to Mike Kean. And as you all know, after January, Mike Kean takes over from Mike Whelan as the leader of the Baker Street Irregulars.
Well, it's wonderful. I have been here before about a year and a half ago with Mike when we were beginning to make some arrangements for this. So I've seen some of the treasures of the library, but to see this exhibit of the Baker Street Irregulars in company with first folio editions of Shakespeare and a first edition of Tamerlane by Poe and things like that is just wonderful and remarkable. It also points out how important these treasures are to be in the company of these other literary treasures as well. So I've seen many things I haven't seen. I knew of them, so they didn't surprise me, but I've never seen them actually, and that's just a pleasure. And I also put a plug in for the Baker Street Irregulars press items. That exhibit along the wall there shows the breadth of BSI press publications going back to the 30s, or actually the 40s, the press being really resurrected and established by Mike Whelan, and the great number of wonderful volumes that have been published in the last 25 years.
And how appropriate that a new volume was released from the BSI Press that very weekend. It's a book by Terry and Linda Hunt called Aboriginals, and it looks at the early attendees and members of the Baker Street Irregulars from 1934 to 1940. And essentially it's a mini biography of everyone that was associated with it during that time. A fascinating little book and a really nice piece of research, and well worth adding to your library if you are into BSI Press material and are interested in the history of the Baker Street Irregulars.
Yeah, really very welcome, and it fills in so many gaps in one's knowledge about the early members of this particular literary society. Mike and Hartley and others referred to some of the treasures of the Lilly, a Shakespeare folio, and so on. And in one of those adjoining rooms that I mentioned earlier on beyond the entranceway at the Lilly were assembled for us to look at, just inches away, a selection of some of the treasures of the Lilly, and we were lucky enough to have the director of the Lilly Library, Joel Silver, there to explain and introduce the contents on display.
I'm Joel Silver. I'm the director of the Lilly Library at Indiana University, Bloomington. What we have here are a few highlights from the collection that we've put out for visitors in the BSI conference to see. Starting from this table here, we have a 15th century illuminated manuscript, a book of hours, a book of prayers to be said, various hours of the day. And as you can see, the colors are quite vibrant and just beautiful to be able to see a manuscript like this. This is a first edition of Vesalius's Anatomy, the first great illustrated anatomical work of 1543. This is the first collection of acts of the U.S. Congress when Congress was meeting in New York, printed in New York in 1789. And because Congress was considering the first amendments to the Constitution, this contains the first printing of the Bill of Rights. And the correction that you see, corrected from cruel and unusual imprisonments to punishments, that was made by the first owner of the book, who was Thomas Jefferson. And it's bound for him as Secretary of State. And so this is Thomas Jefferson's copy of the first printing of the Bill of Rights. This letter was written by George Washington in 1789, and it's his letter accepting the presidency of the United States. Moving to this table, we have a first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, in the original 3 volumes, uncut. A first edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales from 1477, one of about a dozen copies known. A Shakespeare First Folio of 1623, published 7 years after Shakespeare's death. First edition of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice in the original boards. This was also, like several of these others, from Mr. Lilly's collection, J.K. Lilly Jr. First edition of Alice in Wonderland, the 1865 Alice. And also from Mr. Lilly's collection, a first edition in the original 20 parts in 19 of Dickens's Pickwick Papers from 1836-37. And finally, Mr. Lilly's copy of Edgar Allan Poe's Tamerlane, Poe's first book, published anonymously in 1827 in the original wrappers.
Now tell us just for a second, how rare is the Tamerlane?
I think when Mr. Lilly bought it in the late 1920s, there were 8 or 9 copies known. Today we're up to about 14 or so. But this is one of the copies that survive in nearly the best condition of all of the copies. I think there are 1 or 2 other copies that approach this in condition. This was a selection of some of our highlights, and we have another area in the library where this morning we're showing some of the Sherlockian materials, and so we thought we should put out some of the other things from our collections, including highlights in literature and historical materials. There's so much to choose from here. The collections are quite large. We have 450,000 books and 8.5 million manuscripts. Sherlock Holmes is an important part of what we have at the Lilly. Our first director, David A. Randall, was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. His investiture is golden pince-nez. And Mr. Randall built up our Sherlockian collections here over many years. And so really, it's one of the core collections here at the Lilly Library.
That's fascinating, that connection with David Randall. And David is one of the individuals in the Aboriginals book by Terry and Linda Hunt. I do want to make reference to Tamerlane because there's another connection there to Sherlock Holmes. It's a more personal one in my case, and that is, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. During the BSI weekend, Ray Betzner and I went down to the Morgan Library and poked around down there, and they had a Poe exhibit going on. And there was a Tamerlane there. And Ray shared with me an essay that Vincent Sterrett had written called "Have You a Tamerlane in Your Attic?" And I believe this is something he may have touched on the Studies in Sterrett blog. There was a craze, and this would have been right around the time that Lilly was collecting, where people were searching through their attics and other strange places, looking to see if a long ago thrown away copy of Tamerlane was there. And it's amazing to hear Joel tell the story that its rarity has actually decreased since Lily's time. There have been more copies that have turned up, and that's just a wonderful thing when we start talking about these things that are in collections or that certain collectors have, and people suddenly find that I've seen something like that. I have something like that. My grandfather had something like that. It's wonderful how the minds of collectors work.
Yeah, it is, and it's wonderful. All of the cross-pollination, the similarities, the connections, Randall as an early irregular, and so on. And I remember that Sterrett issue around one of the rarest books in American literature, which I think is what the Morgan called it. And I think this is recorded somewhere in one of Sterrett's books. It may be Pennywise and Book Foolish, but in around 1925, the search was kicked off by an article in the Saturday Evening Post, which talked about the book and talked about its value. And so the Saturday Evening Post article resulted in people all over the country, digging through their grandparents' bookshelves and attics. But I think one person actually did come up with a Tamerlane and wrote to the author of that story in the Saturday Evening Post, and that was Vincent Sterrett. And there you are.
That's it. Yeah, there are actually 2 links on Ray's blog about that. One is called "Have You a Tamerlane?" and the other is "How Not to Find One of the Country's Rarest Books" by Vincent Sterrett. The story of Sterrett's hunt for a rare Poe volume has become a book dealer's legend.
Speaking of legends, one of the things that I had forgotten or not even recalled because of my own stupidity was the fact that in addition to being the director of the Lilly Library, Joel is also a Sherlockian of considerable note, and in fact he's the author of The Remarkable Characters of Arthur Conan Doyle, which is a volume that examines some of Conan Doyle's creations in addition to Sherlock Holmes, characters like Professor Challenger and Brigadier Gerard and so on. And it's another reason why it's so great to have the home of the archive at the Lilly Library.
Oh, that's great. I didn't realize that.
Oh, you're just saying that to make me feel better. After I talked to Joel, I realized that he had edited that book, and it was later in the day that I sort of asked him about his Sherlockian interests, which are extensive. And so, but he's never been to a Sherlockian society.
Really?
So we're in very good hands under the watchful eye of Joel Silver.
That's great. No, I've seen the book, and as a matter of fact, it's from the BSI Press. I didn't connect Joel's name with it. That's great.
Oh, well, now I don't feel so bad. Well, and another reason.
Before you go on to the next clip, I do want to rectify one error, and that is I mentioned the trilogy dinner early on, and in fact Vincent Sterrett's 221B, and that's the one I was kind of hedging on. Was published in 1940, not 1944. The third book that was there, in addition to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and Profiles by Gaslight, was The Misadventures of Sherlock Holmes by Ellery Queen. That's the one that was there.
Right. So. And that is associated with a recall. I guess they had to recall the first printing of the first edition because of some objections by Adrian or Dennis or the estate. Am I remembering all that?
That is correct.
Relatively correctly, yeah.
Adrenaline, Conan Doyle decided to shut it down. And the reason those three books in particular in that case were interesting is because those three copies were actually handed out at the dinner. You know, there were certainly many more copies of all of these books printed later on, but these were copies that were there at the dinner that night, and that makes them unique.
Yeah, and another reason why we're in such good hands, in addition to being under the watchful eye of Joel Silver at the Lilly Library, is the work of Erika Dowling. And Erika had a major role in the exhibition and also the installation of the archive at Lilly, and we were lucky enough to talk to her for a few minutes about her perspective on all this.
My name's Erika Dowell, and I work at the Lilly Library, where I'm Associate Director and Curator of Modern Books and Manuscripts. The BSI is such an interesting organization because in some ways it's very modern, but in other ways it's such a blast from the past. You know, as a literary society that gets together for a very traditional kind of dinner entertainment on the birthday weekend, I think it's just fascinating. As well as the organization of the group, right? The idea that you have sort of a lifetime appointment for the commissaire, or the Wiggins, as it's been called in recent decades. You know, that's just very mind-blowing when you're a librarian who's mostly worked with organizations that are, you know, much more structured, and there are elections, and there's a chair, and there's a chair-elect, and everything switches over every few years. This is so different. I worked with Glen Miranker and Ross Davies, and they both flew in. Glen made a couple of visits, but we had a really fun Saturday with Glen and Ross here, just looking through all kinds of stuff, making some decisions about, you know, what our theme should be and what were some of the interesting materials. I personally love to see the different traces that women make in the course of the history of the BSI. I love listening to the oral history that they did with Evelyn Herzog and hearing about her experience, but also seeing the different nominations. There's this one letter that talks about Edgar W. Smith nominating his secretary to be honored as the woman back in the 50s, and the way that that's changed over time I think is just fascinating. There's some great correspondence we have around that, you know, Tom Sticks being congratulated, or some men who seem to be sort of pushing back a little bit on the fact that women were now included. And it's so funny. I've been married longer than the BSI has been allowing women in their organization, which is a little mind-blowing when you first hear about it too. But but the group's come a long way since then. The book marketplace for rare books, it's still dominated by men. So, you know, there are many more men who are selling books. I think the number of women collecting is growing. But I also, you know, from a librarianship perspective, I know a lot of women who think they collect books, but they don't think they're serious enough maybe to call themselves collectors. So I think there's a little bit of a gender imbalance in being able to self-identify as a collector in some ways. That a man and a woman, and maybe with similar collections, you know, the woman would be like, oh, I don't really collect that seriously. And so that's something that whenever I have a chance, I try to tell myself not to downplay it like that, or to tell other people not to downplay it like that. But there are some interesting things going on. There's Honey and Wax Booksellers has a book collecting prize for women, young women, I think. And there are a couple of bookshop second shelf books opened up in London a couple years ago that's just devoted to books by women, obviously for any kind of collector. But I think there's some different interesting things going on. But I do think that I'd love to hear more about women collecting in the pages of fine books and collections, or in other contexts where they focus on great collectors.
How wonderful. I think that's a really great perspective that Erika brings up there.
Yes, and I have to apologize for mangling her name. Her name is Erika Dowell. I should point out, these are longer conversations. What's happened here is that we have cut out all of my boring and annoying questions, just to give you the content from Erika. So that colors a bit the delivery, but I was just delighted to talk to her. And her reference to Honey and Wax Booksellers is a reference to our friend and fellow irregular Rebecca Romney, who is part of Honey and Wax and who's been instrumental in this recognition prize, this annual prize. I guess it's an annual prize for women collectors. So it was really great to talk to Erika. And one thing we should point out is that the other reason, among the many reasons why this was a really great weekend and really rewarding, is that the Lilly Library is about to close for renovations that are going to take 18 months. And so Erika and Joel and the staff and so on are moving across the campus to what I believe is the regular student library at Indiana University, to the 10th floor and the first floor. I think Erika was describing where folks are going to go. And as they do an upgrade on the physical plan in terms of temperature control and reorganization of space and other things at the Lilly. And all of these materials, the Lilly's holdings, will essentially be put in storage. And I want you to know that I did suggest to Erika that I had room in my garage, but she...
Nice try.
Yeah, she didn't
demurred,
look. She wasn't enthusiastic about that.
Well, your garage is not climate controlled. I've been there. That's part of the problem.
Oh yeah, that must be it.
And you have access to it. That's the other problem.
Yeah.
I do want to point out one small update that you may not have been aware of. While our friend and fellow irregular and rare book expert Rebecca Romney, and I hear of Sherlock Everywhere guest Rebecca Romney,
yes,
was associated with Honey and Wax. She has since opened her own rare bookstore called Type Punch Matrix in the Washington, D.C. area. It specializes in pivotal works from pretty much every field. And Rebecca and her partner bring their expertise to their new firm.
Oh, that's right. I should have remembered that. Thank you. That's good. Yes. We do need to refer to Rebecca appropriately.
Yes. And it's clear that Burt's brain needs a little rest, so let's listen to him patter on in the dulcet tones about Wessex Press.
In the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, every November 15, we mark the death of Albertus Magnus, the great philosopher and theologian in 1280. He described the ideals of friendship in his great work, De Bono. If only he had a college named after him. But you don't need to matriculate to get your degree in Sidney Paget. Not when you can own the complete Paget portfolio. Every Sherlock Holmes illustration by Sidney Paget, reproduced directly from the Strand magazine, and the surviving original artwork, curated by Nicholas Utekin. This ultimate archive of the art that created the universal image of Sherlock Holmes is available right now at wessexpress.com. Over the river and through the woods trot fast my dapple gray, spring over the ground like a hunting hound on this Thanksgiving Day. Before your family gathers, reach for the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
Well, let's get back to a couple more clips that we have here as we wrap up the time at the Lilly. You went back to the source to Ross Davies, who was our, I wouldn't just call him an MC. He was kind of the host for the weekend. He had helped to spearhead this entire event. He and Glenn had spoken to us back on episode 175. But what did you talk to Ross about?
Well, Ross, we really talked about two things, and I wanted to begin in talking to Ross with getting him on the record about exactly how the conference launched, because we haven't mentioned that yet. And in a way, it's one of the most interesting things about the weekend to think that the panel discussions that we've had, which we haven't talked about, the Saturday afternoon program, the exhibition, all of this kicked off with what we might describe as some extraordinary circumstances. So that's where we started in talking with Ross.
I am a Baker Street Irregular, and I am the incumbent conference organizer for the Baker Street Irregulars, which is perhaps one of the most enjoyable impresario roles on the planet, because it's all interesting, enjoyable people and topics, and this is the important part for the organizer, all errors in good faith are forgiven on the spot. So it's great fun.
So we just finished quite a day and a conference that began with many unexpected things, including a power outage at the Lilly Library. And you've done a splendid job, and the team has done a splendid job compressing a day and a half of activities into probably 3/4 of a day, keeping things on schedule. Tell me a little bit about the experience.
What happened here, at least from my own experience, was that around 10 a.m. Friday morning, that is yesterday morning, I got a phone call from Terry Hunt, a longtime irregular and, in fact, one of the presenters at this conference. Terry was calling to say that he had just been evicted from the Lilly Library, where he was being sent home, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the power had gone out. Now, this was unfortunate news for Terry because he didn't get to be in the library, but it was particularly unfortunate for we, meaning mostly Glen Miranker, Erika Dowell, Marianne Bradley, and myself, who had organized this conference, because we had planned for 100 Baker Street Irregulars and other enthusiastic Sherlockians to spend the entire afternoon in that library. So we spent a big chunk of the afternoon in the company of many amused and understanding Sherlockians trying to figure out what to do when the library was in the dark. What we ended up doing was postponing our Friday afternoon activities to Saturday morning and then taking pretty much everything we had planned to do on Saturday morning and do it all on Saturday afternoon. And fortunately, this is a good-spirited group with a fairly long attention span. And so we had a few fewer breaks than we might have, and things moved a little more briskly than they might have. And we got through the essentials of our agenda in the afternoon, and at least as importantly, those 100 Sherlockians got to spend a full, rich, and interesting morning at the Lilly Library looking at this exhibition titled The History of the BSI in 221 Objects, which was, even for someone who was involved in the planning, just an unbelievable experience. It's like living in history for a few hours. It was great fun. From the historical standpoint, there were the kinds of artifacts that are for Sherlockians the equivalent of going to Washington, D.C. to the National Archives to see the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Here there were cases that contained complete sets of pristine and inscribed copies of the books from the famous trilogy dinner. And there was the typescript copy of 221B by Vincent Sterrett, inscribed to Edgar Smith. That, by the way, the second item there, the 221B, was lent by Ray Betzner, the leading living authority on Sterrett, and much of the trilogy material was lent by Glen Miranker, the leading living collector and authority on, well, many things. At the other end of the spectrum, the modern end, one of the niftiest things was a beautiful display of one of Bonnie MacBird's illustrations for her first best-selling Sherlockian novel, Art in the Blood, that also included this very educational sort of artistic flowchart explaining how she creates these paintings, which is, and this is consistent with the way Bonnie approaches her novel writing in general, I think, to sort of steep herself in the times. Not to ignore modern tools, but to really get into 1895 up to the neck. And so she, just to put it in its simplest terms, she echoes Sidney Paget in the way she creates her own illustrations. And this was a unique opportunity to see how that was done.
I thought Ross was going to say how Bonnie immersed herself in the world of whiskey in Scotland, which is always helpful.
Yes, that's for her current book. But Bonnie is, I imagine, somewhat unique, if not completely unique, in that in addition to writing her books, she also illustrates them in, as Ross described, this Paget-like approach. But a couple of other things about Ross. The wonderful thing that really characterized the conference was the dialogue with the attendees. Often when you go to conferences, you've got someone at a podium who's showing slides and talking, and it's mostly one communicating to many. But here we really maintained an active dialogue with participants, and I wanted to talk to Ross specifically about that because he did it in a very ingenious way, and along the way created some very rare objects.
What we did was we took, I guess what you'd call a tool of the trade in public company meetings, shareholder meetings, where what companies will sometimes do when they're going to have a shareholder meeting is they will provide to shareholders who plan to attend the meeting what might be called question cards, where a shareholder can write a question on a card in advance and submit it. And what that does is it sort of encourages the questioner to make their question short and clear and to the point, and it enables the answerers to see the collected interests of the people with questions and to be efficient about answering them. So what we did was we took that model and applied it to our presenters and our panelists. And what we did was we asked each presenter or panelist to send us a picture of something that connects them to the Sherlockian world. So one side of the card has basically, it's a color postcard with a picture of something meaningful to that person. And on the other side, there's a photograph of the person and a short sketch, biographical sketch of them and a few lines on which they could ask a question. So as people showed up for the conference and checked in, they got a set of these cards. There were a total of 22 of these question cards. And during the course of the run-up to the conference, and even while the proceedings were going on, people were writing questions on the cards and handing them in, and we were feeding them up to the moderators and the presenters, and they were reading off the cards and answering the questions. And people seemed to enjoy it.
Well, it was wonderful. And you also had a little addition of the process, which is once you got a card used, you got the card given back to you in pristine form, and if your question was actually used on the panel, you got a special card. So you've produced actually quite a collectible here.
That was not unintentional. Well noted, Burt.
Well done. Well, thank you for all the efforts. And just as a shout out, would you like to shout out to all of the people who were part of this effort and helped you?
Oh my goodness. Well, I will be incomplete when I do this. But with apologies to the people who I don't get to, the people who designed and built the exhibition were Glen Miranker and Erika Dowell, in collaboration with a number of Erika's colleagues, including Rebecca Bauman. And with the support of Joel Silver, the director of the Lilly, who is an extraordinary Sherlockian scholar in his own right. On the irregular end, it was Glenn and Marianne Bradley, and for some of the special publications that you may see in other contexts, but that I won't go into too much detail about now, there was Steve Doyle and Mark Gagan and Frank Cho and Mike McSwiggan and Mike Whelan, and again Glen Miranker and Bob Katz, because part of what ended up happening with this conference was, because it is a conference to a large extent about collecting, we ended up generating a whole bundle of collectibles. If you attended this conference, by the time you leave, you will have a set of these collectible cards. You will have, well, I will call it a pamphlet that you may read about elsewhere at some point. And just to be particularly, sneaky or coy about this, Burt, there is something yet to come.
But there are also great memories. So,
yes, indeed.
So thanks to you and the team.
Thank you, Burt.
I like how Ross left that with something yet to come. We'll have to stay tuned for that. Well, in the meantime, for those of you who could not attend or did not attend, we do have a special offer here at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We do have 4 extra sets of these collectible cards complete. And they have been, the cover, the wrapper that they're in has been autographed by, let me make sure I can make this out, by Ross, by Erika Dowell, and it looks like by Glen Miranker, and dated November 9th, 2019, with a nice BSI stamp. They are unopened, so if having something in pristine condition is important to you, that's still possible. But you can also pry open the envelope and take these 30 cards out and take a look at them yourself. The only way to get these, folks, is by making a donation on PayPal or Patreon right now for $100. The proceeds will be turned over to the BSI Trust, the BSI Archive, and there are 4 copies, 4 of these collections that are available. So, act now before they get sold out. The collectors that were not there will, I'm sure, be salivating over this. In addition, we have one other collectible available. It is called Commissionaire, Julian Wolfe and his Baker Street Irregulars. It is a teaser chapter. It's a pamphlet. It's a teaser chapter from her biography of Julian Wolfe that will be coming out next year in 2020. There are literally none of these available outside of folks who attended the conference. It is a conference exclusive. This is one of 152 copies. So if you would like one of these copies, the only copy that we have, then we would request $152 from you. That will go toward the BSI Archive. So $152 for the single Commissionaire pamphlet, or $100 for one of 4 of the collectible cards from the conference. Just be clear when you are making your pledge what it's for, and we will be in touch if you happen to be one of 5 people that are so successful.
We should point out that the pamphlet, which is really lovely, it's like a very thin, small paperback book. It was by Sonia Featherston. Sonia is the author of the upcoming, I don't know that we really mentioned that. Sonia is the author of the upcoming Julian Wolfe book, which will be published at some future time. Is that going to be out in January?
Yeah, I see someone was multitasking. It's going to be out next summer at the BSI Empire Conference.
Oh, next summer, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So stay tuned for that. That's something that'll be available to everyone and will contain more than just this single chapter.
Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. If you mentioned Sonia already, and I just restated it, I'm sorry. I didn't think that you actually called out her
That's
name.
okay. I may have glossed over it in my excitement to get to the description, but it never hurts to have Sonia's name mentioned more than once. Of course, you may recall our conversation with Sonia at the end of last year when she talked with us about Bliss Austin and her biography of him I think it was a standalone issue. It was part of the biography series the BSI is working on. It was not a Christmas annual. Of course, Bliss used to send out Christmas stockings, he called them, that were kind of like a Christmas annual type thing. And interestingly, to bring this full circle, the books and ephemera that were part of the trilogy dinner display at the Lilly Library, those were on loan from Glen Miranker, one of the people who signed the collectible cards, and Glen got them from the collection of one Bliss Austin. So it's all interrelated here. It's positively incestuous.
Close harmony. We like to think of it as close harmony.
That works.
Well, should we talk a little bit about the afternoon? You know, we've talked mostly about the conference and its execution, but we haven't talked about what actually happened on Saturday afternoon. And we had a series of panel discussions. The first one, after Mike welcomed us to the conference, featured Ross introducing Peggy Perdue on a panel with Peggy, Erika Dowell, and Joel Silver and Tom Horrocks. And the focus on this was, I guess, building an archive. I know you probably got the title of the session right there.
I do, in fact, and it is. I'm looking through here because we were the times were a little bit off because of the power outage, but that was. Let's see. There was accessing the BSI archive, how the archiving actually works at the Lilly. And I think that was Erika and Joel with Tom. And Tom was up later on in the afternoon with Mike Whelan and Michael Kean talking about where the future of the BSI archive is, which is interesting because, you know, we spend so much time looking at the past, looking at everything that has been accumulated. And they talked about where it was going. So it was really an interesting set of talks, you know, and I don't want to rehash every one of them here for the sake of time, but, you know, from using the archives, accessing the archives to how they were featured or used in different publications, the oral history series, you know, that was fascinating. I know you're involved with that, Burt. You want to talk a little bit about the oral history series and how that was covered at the conference?
Oh, yes. Well, Marsha Pollak is the leading light behind the oral history series today, and she and Jen Eaker are moving this forward. And I'm embarrassed because I'm one of these one of the people who hasn't submitted his own oral history yet, as you know, but then neither of you. But my role in this is just to contribute a little opening and closing to these. And there's been an enormous accomplishment. I didn't count up all of the people whose oral histories have been completed, but the drive is to connect with irregulars and provide a structured interview where they recount a little bit about their lives and about their Sherlockian life and so on, so that we don't lose. You know, you mentioned earlier this great book by Terry Hunt and Linda Hunt about the early irregulars, so we don't lose the history of who these people were and what their circumstance was and who their friends were and what their contribution was, because many of them are really remarkable people in terms of their accomplishment. And Marsha did discuss that. Well, I think Marsha and Jen discussed that on a panel.
Yeah. And for the record, I just want to make sure everyone knows that it's Jen Aker.
That's right. We had her explanation of how to pronounce her name, which was punctuated by someone asking her, "Are you sure?"
Yeah, of course. And of course it was a guy. Yeah. Are you sure?
Yeah. Oh, that can't be right.
Yeah. That became one of the go-to stories over the weekend.
Yeah.
And she was a good sport about it too.
Well, clearly she's wrong. I mean, I just called her Glen Eaker. It must be Glen Eaker.
Well, and see, this is why the oral history series is important, because someday down the line, someone will be reading about Jen Aker, and they will mistakenly in conversation refer to her as Jen Eaker. But if they go to her oral history story as part of the archives, they'll hear that it is in fact Aker, and she is sure.
Yeah, pretty certain. Although we should check in with her regularly and see if her opinion has changed.
If this changed, yeah.
Yeah. One of the interesting, well, all of the panels were interesting. One of the other things in the afternoon was Ross introduced a panel on how to build a personal collection, which included among its participants Glen Miranker and Peter Blau. And what I liked about that was Glen talked about how he got started and who his mentor was, and he's talked about that with us on I Hear of Sherlock. His mentor was Dan Poznansky, and Peter talked about how he started thanks to Ben Abramson, and I think Peter discussed that as well, and Peter cited John Bennett Shaw as a mentor. But in that conversation, they were both asked about the major things that they've added to their collection over the years, what they viewed as the items that they remembered the most. And Glenn mentioned the manuscript for The Dancing Men, obviously because of his parallel interest in cryptography in addition to Sherlock Holmes, and the fact that he has acquired 2 pages of the manuscript for The Hound of the Baskervilles. And Peter told a great story about the Crowborough edition of the Sherlock Holmes stories, in which he traded one edition, which sounded like it was in sold one edition which sounded like it was in pristine condition with dust jackets for another edition without the dust jackets, but that other edition happened to be owned by Dame Jean Conan Doyle.
I think I would have done the same thing in that circumstance. No question. And someone said, well, why didn't you just switch the dust jackets? Put the dust jackets from the original collection you had on the Dame Jean Conan Doyle version. And Glenn even sprang to Peter's defense. He said, that's just frowned upon. Collectors don't do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then in the rest of the panel, the rest of the afternoon, we had an interesting discussion with Andy Fusco and Otto and other people on scouting for books and how the internet has changed book collecting. And Les talked a little bit about legal and tax issues of these sorts of collections. And I was very pleased because Les advised the attendees that if they were really worried about what to do with their collection, that the generally best accepted procedure for thinking about where to dispose of your rare artifacts was to plan to give them to me. And I thought that was really thoughtful.
I love that. I really love that. And, continuing on the discussion with Otto and the internet, I think the main point there, and Nick Basbanes was up there as well, who's written about collectors, and he collects collectors, and that's how he defined it. What's important, particularly with collectors who are, well, whether you're starting out or whether you're steeped in the field, is the relationships that you build with booksellers, because they can be so helpful and can advise, can serve as a second set of eyes or ears out there, and those relationships are so important. And later on in the evening, it was actually the after dinner kind of a fireside chat between Glenn and Otto. We had a chance to ask questions from the audience. And I asked Otto to reflect on his favorite bookshop or bookseller throughout his collecting history. And he reminisced back to his time when he was first working at the New York Post, when he was fresh out of college. And he was just beginning to collect books, and he really didn't know what he was doing. And there was a book collector or a bookshop, a rare book dealer, who had a brownstone somewhere in New York. I can't remember exactly where in Manhattan it was. And we should have Otto on the show sometime to tell this story. I wish we were recording that session, because it was just charming. But he made it clear to Otto that when you're collecting, you should always try and get a dust-jacketed version, and how to look for better copies of books, and always trading up to the next best copy that you can find or afford. And it's these kinds of micro lessons that booksellers and dealers can bring to the collector that don't necessarily come from just scrolling through eBay or even finding a message board or forum for collectors. These kinds of things necessarily need to be passed on as part of the oral tradition and as part of the relationship that's built between collector and dealer.
Yeah, I love the conversation, the fireside chat with Otto. He told remarkable stories, which perhaps it's just as well some of them weren't recorded, of his experience with certain authors, but it was amazing. And Otto, I gather, has written a memoir which will be available next year, which is what I gathered from parts of that conversation.
Well, it was an event very specific in its nature, but very wide-ranging in the topics that were presented under that umbrella. And I think Glen and Ross and the entire team that put it together should be extremely proud of themselves. And if anything, I hope we've given you an opportunity to understand what some of these events are like and to get yourself ready, whether it's for the BSI weekend, which is coming up in January. I think it's the 15th through the 18th. And certainly for the Empire Conference that's happening next summer at West Point. Something certainly to look forward to. Well, I guess that means that we've got a little bit of news to cover here, and then we'll get into the quiz. It was a nice opportunity to listen to those sounds that you collected there, Burt. I'm grateful that you were able to take your roving mic and get all over the Lily.
No, it was a lot of fun. Really was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you gilded the Lily for us. Sorry.
Yes.
Somebody had to.
and you did.
Indeed. Well, it is worth noting that in the world of Sherlock Holmes, there are always things going on, things to be aware of. And I mentioned the BSI weekend, and I think we are right about the time where you will see an update to bsiweekend.com with the festivities, and of course the Baker Street Irregulars website, which you can find at bakerstreetirregulars.com, has a mailing list, so they will automatically mail you when updates to events and book launches and things like that happen as well. So get on over to bakerstreetirregulars.com and sign up for their email notifications. And you know what that music means? It means it's time to play everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show, Canonical Couplets. That's right. It's when we give you 2 lines of poetry about one of the stories, and you simply have to guess which story it refers to. And if you are among the correct answers that's chosen, then you get a prize from the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere vaults. And the last time we were here, this is what we gave you. Of great evil, Holmes unearthed the root. The game was undeniably afoot. Burt, do you know which story that refers to?
Yes, that was the story about the fellow with the terribly overhanging brow. That was the devil's forehead, wasn't it?
the devil's forehead. Yeah, no, not that. You had the first 2 words right. The devil's food cake. No, the devil's foot. The devil's foot. Yeah. Well, we had a number of entries there, a little down from the previous week, but that's okay. So what we're going to do here is spin the big prize wheel. It goes around, and we're going to wait for it to slow down a little bit. And as it does, we see it lands on number 9, lucky number 9, and that corresponds to Daniel Dickholtz. Daniel, congratulations. We will be getting in touch with you and picking something out from the vaults for you. Congratulations. And now, that means it's time for this week's canonical couplet. Are you ready? The words were said, and help came rather late. And listen to that preacher's Billingsgate. If you know the answer to this, put canonical couplet in the subject of your email that's addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com. If you're among the many correct answers and we choose you, you may win a prize. Good luck. Now, this one is a little tougher this week.
Yeah.
A little tougher.
I like these.
If you think you know the answer, that this would be a great week to participate because you might not have as much competition. So there we go. Well, I think that just about does it for us now. We will be back again in 2 weeks' time on the 30th with the latest episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. It's a new book from the University of Chicago Press. What is it? Well, it's related to Sherlock Holmes. We can tell you that. Why should you listen? Well, for the sake of the trust, which is also why you should make sure you get in your $100 to try and get those collectible editions. Don't forget about that. Just check the show notes for a link. In the meantime, I am the always linked Scott Monty.
And I'm looking for my Lilly Library card. I'm Burt Wolder.
And together, we say... The game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.